So Tom Bukovac posted a really cool video the other day from a hotel room called Hallmarks of an Intermediate Guitar Player. And there were some really interesting points that I thought it'd be worth kind of talking about, because this is something that I get subscribers, even, you know, at my lowly bedroom level, asking me questions about. And I thought, well, yeah, if Tom Bukovac is telling us that, you know, we need to work on our timing, we need to work on our bending, being more intentional, we need to work on not rushing and leaving kind of spaces in our playing potentially. And what I wanted to talk about in this video was kind of playing with less tension, because he was talking about being in the studio with a guy. And as I've said in the video that I did on timing, you know, practical ways that we can actually work on improving our timing. I've got another video planned on that as well, by the way, talking to one of my favourite drummers, Joe Harris. This is a conversation that he was having around, like, literally being in the studio. So you imagine you're in the studio recording and Tom Bukovac's kind of looking over your shoulder. It's going to be pretty nerve-wracking, right? More than your average kind of gig, I would imagine. But he's like watching this guy, and the guy's maybe rushing, the guy's maybe playing with a lot of tension, and these things. I think, you know, if it was me playing in that situation, what would I be thinking? Yeah, I just thought it'd be an interesting kind of concept. So he's talking about playing with less tension, and I think this is a really interesting point, because we do have examples of players that maybe play with what you might think is not the most optimal technique. I think of guys maybe even that have true fire courses like Marty Friedman, who, if you look at his right hand kind of picking, this doesn't seem to be, like, for you or I, or for many people, like, is that the absolute optimal position? Maybe not. Is there an amount of tension that the guy is playing with that looks a certain way? Maybe. So I think this is quite a personal thing. But here's the real reason that I think we should be listening to someone like Tom Bukovac, because Tom, I believe, has been playing for hours and hours every day for decades, and he talked in a video relatively recently about not having arthritis yet, and he talks about, you know, maybe it's coming, but up to this point. And, you know, if we look at some players like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Jimi Hendrix, some of these guys that really didn't live long enough to see where technique might start to kind of fall apart. And we could hear about guys like Steve Morse, I think, as well, who I think has quite a lot of trouble now. His technique to me looks like, you know, there's quite a lot of tension involved. And there are players that kept their ability right up until the point that they died. I think of Alan Holdsworth in particular as like a real peak of this. So even though Alan was not in the best of health, and I think drunk quite a lot, and I think basically his technique stayed really decent until he died, unfortunately. And this is a guy who didn't play with tons of tension, played with 8-gauge strings, and I think that's maybe something that we should look at as players, even with whatever technique you've got going on, and all of that is very personal, that possibly playing with less tension might be something that we should aim for. So I can remember Rick Graham being the first time that I kind of saw anyone talking about this on YouTube. And he was talking about it, I think, more from a technique point of view. Like if you want real kind of fluid and fluent and, you know, all these types of things in playing, you actually don't need to play with quite as much tension as you are. And one way to kind of figure this out is that whilst you're kind of playing a note, do this thing where you kind of play with the level of tension that you would normally have and notice that, and then start to gradually see, you know, roughly what it feels like to let that note kind of not fret, and how different is that to the level of pressure that you normally play with. You know, tension and pressure, these things go kind of hand in hand. Try gradually with kind of each finger, play with your default level, and then take it off to the level where it's no longer really making the note, and see how different you know, if I play the same phrase but with kind of default and normal tension, you can play it with like easily about half of the pressure that you're normally playing with, probably, is one of the kind of key things that I would think about here. Like, whatever level of pressure you're playing with, you can probably have it and still be getting these notes to sound. You're probably playing with a lot of wasted kind of energy. It's kind of really the conclusion that I came out of the Rick Graham video with, and, you know, similar to what Tom Bukovac's saying. Tom Bukovac goes a bit further and talks about it kind of choking off your tone if you're playing with too much pressure, as well as kind of you're playing a little bit possibly less in tune than you would be if you were playing lighter. And so that's a really good kind of thought as well. I've also heard Tom talk about sort of letting the guitar do more of the work. So part of that, I guess, might be down to setup and tone and stuff. But where you're not, you know, intentionally setting up a guitar with super high action and super heavy strings that you're finding difficult to play, instead kind of having the guitar set up in a way that encourages you to play with kind of less tension. That might be lighter gauge strings. That might be, you know, lower action. You know, some of these things worth thinking about. A lot of it, though, I think is more about just being conscious that, you know, there is a level that I'm playing with that might be, you know, I could probably lighten things up 50% and still be getting notes out of the guitar, and maybe getting less fatigue, less tension in the hand, and maybe more longevity. Another thing to think about, and in terms of tone and stuff, is this right hand. Now, this is an area that I think a lot of us have a tendency to play with quite a lot of velocity. And I get questions like, can you talk about your right hand? Like, And what I would say is that I try to remember to sort of play a little bit lighter with the right hand. What it means is that, you know, if your first note has all of that velocity, you know, the next note is necessarily going to have less. Whereas if you start off with a bass line of, you know, where I'm starting off with a lighter touch, and then when I want something else, it's, I guess, that thing that Tom talks about quite a lot, where you're being more intentional, where it's like, if I start off with velocity at kind of 50%, I can go lighter, I can go heavier, but what it really means is that there's kind of this headroom element and dynamics to my playing. So it not only means, you know, playing with less tension in your left hand, but also your right hand. Sort of treat that a little bit less like, I don't know, a strumming instrument, and more like a painting instrument. Some really cool players like Robin Ford might be a good place to kind of check out, where it's like the right hand is very much a... where, you know, you're kind of less thinking about digging into the string and down, but maybe more kind of bouncy. And Eric Johnson talks about that as well. If you want to get like more close-up shots of that sort of stuff, Truefire is a really good place to see Robin Ford and Eric Johnson playing in super high fidelity with lots of great angles. You can get 40% off of any of their courses using the code JNC40, or you could use the code JNC100 to get $100 off of the All Access Pass, in which case you could jump in and out of Robin Ford courses, Eric Johnson courses. Eric Haugen's got some new stuff on there around modes and also the cage and all that stuff. You've got Guthrie Trapp on there, talking of Tom Bukovac. Loads of courses, you could jump in and out of that. JNC 100 is a good way to get involved in the Truefire stuff for some of this stuff. So another really key thing that I think we use a lot of tension for are things like bar chords, because we have it in our mind that these things are actually quite difficult. And so a bar chord might be another area where you might want to kind of look at recalibrating the amount of pressure that you're playing with. Like, my default is something like this, and I definitely get fatigued if I'm doing like an acoustic gig using them. But actually, I could probably play with half the tension again and things would be absolutely fine. And another thing about that toniness, there's a little bit of more air to a note which is not plucked as hard, right? And it's not about everything being super lightly plucked, but sometimes bearing in mind that dynamics are definitely a thing that we should be kind of being conscious of. Like Tom talks about, maybe bends without vibrato as being kind of impactful, as well soft notes. Or even notes that you don't pick at all. Can be super expressive. So that's kind of just some ideas that I'm trying to think about, and some practical ways that I think we can think about touch, because I think it's worth talking about. You know, we're talking about longevity, we're talking about tension in our hands, but also expressing ourselves in a different way. So I think really important, if Tom Bukovac is telling you to kind of pay attention to these things, I think it's good advice. He's a guy that's not only playing the stuff, got the health, kept his hand health for these many years, but he's also, you know, producing this stuff and looking over the shoulders of other guitarists and saying what he's noticed other people doing. So worth looking at. Yeah, I'll put that backing track up on Patreon for you guys. Hopefully that was something you would dig in. But yeah, something to bear in mind. And when I get asked about touch, these are some of the things that I'm trying to think about. Like, just in general, play a bit softer, a bit less tension, and let the guitar do more of the work, maybe. Cheers for stopping by. If you've got tips that you want to share below, or revelations, feel free to do so. I think that's an important part of kind of this talking about guitar stuff. You know, when we think of stuff that is actually making a difference, it's kind of cool to be able to share with people. Cheers for stopping by.